throwaway account because my family members are active on Reddit and I need this space to finally tell my truth without judgment or retaliation. This is the story I've been carrying for years, the narrative that shaped my entire existence, the journey from being a forgotten ghost in my own household to becoming a man they couldn't ignore, only resent, and how I learned to survive that resentment without letting it destroy me. For as long as I can remember, I existed in the margins of my family's world, a background character in a story that never seemed to require my presence or input. I was the second child, born into a household that had already found its star. My older sister, who arrived 3 years before me like a comet, brilliant and commanding attention from the moment she entered the world. My parents, particularly my mother, seemed to be a different version of themselves around her. They were animated, engaged, present in ways that I would spend decades trying to understand. When I was born, it felt less like a celebration and more like a footnote to an already complete story. My earliest memory, one that has haunted me through therapy and countless sleepless nights, is of sitting in my high chair while my mother cooed over my sister's first steps, taking video after video, calling relatives, her voice filled with a pride and joy that I can still hear echoing through the years. I was sitting right there, in the same room, but it was as though I was watching the scene through frosted glass. Present but unseen, existing but not matching. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. It was the foundational pattern of my childhood, repeated so many times that by the age of 7 or 8, I had internalized the message completely. I was not the kind of child that generated excitement or pride. I was not the kind of child worth putting cameras on. I was not the kind of child who deserved the spotlight or validation. My sister, on the other hand, seemed to be made for attention. She was outgoing, articulate beyond her years, physically graceful, and possessed an innate ability to charm adults in a way that felt almost supernatural. My parents enrolled her in dance classes, piano lessons, debate clubs, drama productions. They seemed determined to provide her with every possible avenue for achievement and expression. When she performed in her school plays, the entire family attended, sometimes with extended relatives, and my parents would practically beam with pride, their applause echoing through the auditorium as if their daughter had just won an Oscar. For me, the experience was entirely different. I was a quieter child, more introspective, more comfortable in libraries and with books than on stages or playing fields. I loved science, spent hours conducting experiments in the backyard, sketched in notebooks, wrote stories that I kept hidden away because I was afraid of judgment. When I brought home report cards with grades identical to or sometimes better than my sister's, they were met with a cursory nod and placed on the kitchen counter, often getting knocked behind other papers within days. When my sister brought home the same grades, they were photographed, printed, framed, and displayed on the wall for months. I remember one particular incident that crystallized everything for me. I had spent weeks working on a detailed painting for my mother's birthday, a portrait of her that I'd labored over after school, studying her face in photographs, trying to capture the subtle sadness I sometimes saw in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. I was so proud of it, so hopeful that this gift might finally elicit the kind of warmth and attention I craved. On her birthday, I presented it to her with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest. She glanced at it while checking her phone, thanked me briefly, and set it aside to open my sister's gift. A simple sketch of the family dog that took about 15 minutes to complete. That sketch was framed and hung on the living room wall within a week. My portrait was placed in the hall closet, and I learned that day that my effort, my care, my love, were not sufficient to merit her attention. My father was a different kind of absence, not deliberately cruel but profoundly preoccupied, a man who had inherited a small family business from his own stern, demanding parents and seemed to carry the weight of that responsibility like a physical burden he could never quite set down. He was at the office before dawn most mornings and returned home exhausted in the evenings, collapsing into his armchair with a newspaper or remote control, seemingly too drained to engage with any of us. However, when my sister wanted to discuss something, he would suddenly find energy, would put down his paper and listen intently, offering advice and encouragement. When I tried to engage him, tried to show him my science projects or ask his opinion on things that interested me, his responses were usually monosyllabic. "That's nice. Good job. Ask your mother," delivered without looking up from whatever had captured his attention. This selective attention was perhaps even more damaging than outright rejection because it created confusion. It made me question whether the problem was something inherent to me, something broken about the way I presented myself or the things I cared about. The business he ran was also unstable, perpetually on the edge of crisis, which meant that financial stress, tension, and worry permeated the household like a constant, invisible fog. My parents argued about money frequently, their voices rising late at night when they thought we were asleep, and I would lie in bed listening to them, feeling the anxiety seep into my bones, internalizing it as if it were my responsibility to fix it, as if my very existence might be contributing to their problems by requiring resources and attention they could barely afford to give. School became my refuge, a place where my intelligence and effort were actually noticed and valued. My teachers recognized something in me. Perhaps hunger, perhaps potential, or maybe just the quiet desperation of a child seeking validation wherever he could find it. By the time I reached middle school, I had learned to perform academic excellence almost as a survival mechanism, not for my family but for myself, for the internal sense of worthiness that came from seeing good grades, from being praised by teachers, from winning academic competitions. I developed a thick skin regarding my family's indifference and began constructing an identity independent of their approval. I spent my lunch periods in the library, joined the science club, started a tech interest group with my friends, and buried myself in books about innovation, entrepreneurs, and people who had overcome odds to build something meaningful. By 13, I had taught myself basic HTML and CSS, spending countless nights watching YouTube tutorials on a hand-me-down laptop that was ancient even by early 2000 standards. The internet became my mentor, my community, my escape hatch from a house that didn't know what to do with me. I was teaching myself things that my school didn't even offer, learning about web design, digital marketing, the emerging world of e-commerce, things that felt like magic, like gateways to a future where I might matter, where my efforts would be recognized and rewarded, where I could build something that proved my worth to the world, if not to my family. High school is where things began to shift in subtle but significant ways. The family business hit a major rough patch. A supplier had cheated my father, contracts fell through, and suddenly there was real financial stress, the kind that moved from background noise to crisis. My parents fought more intensely, and the house filled with a heaviness that was palpable. My mother seemed to age years and months, her face drawn with worry, her voice sharp with stress. My father became even more withdrawn, working even longer hours, seemingly trying to outrun the problem through sheer force of will. In the midst of this chaos, my sister and I handled it differently. She rebelled, demanding more expensive things, more activities, more parental attention, as if unconsciously trying to hold them together through force of personality and achievement. I retreated further inward, working part-time at a local computer repair shop, squirreling away every penny I earned, determined to become self-sufficient, determined to never have to ask them for anything again. By 16, I was making decent money fixing computers for neighbors, building websites for small local businesses, teaching myself everything I could through free online courses. I was driven by an urgency that my peers didn't seem to share. They were worried about dates and college applications and college parties, but I was laser-focused on building skills, building a reputation, building the foundation for a life where I would never be financially dependent on anyone, never be dismissed because I didn't have the resources to demand attention. My parents barely noticed any of this. I had become so self-sufficient that I required almost nothing from them. I handled my own transportation, bought my own clothes, prepared my own meals, managed my own academic situation. I was, in essence, becoming a ghost in my own home, and I think they preferred it that way because it required nothing of them, demanded nothing, created no additional burden. When I mentioned college plans, my parents' response was lukewarm at best. My sister was being pushed toward prestigious universities with full family financial support. My father was already discussing connections with alumni at his alma mater, already laying the groundwork for her success. For me, the expectation seemed to be that I would either figure it out myself or not go at all. This hurt, of course, even though I had built such a thick shell, even though I had convinced myself I didn't need their support, some small part of me still craved it, still wanted them to believe in me, still wanted them to be proud of something I accomplished. I chose a university that offered me a substantial merit scholarship, covering most of my tuition and room and board costs. My parents attended my graduation from high school. My sister's graduation party was elaborate and celebratory, attended by what seemed like half the neighborhood. Mine was acknowledged with a handshake from my father and a congratulations from my mother before they rushed off to some obligation related to my sister's post-graduation plans. But I didn't let it break me anymore because by then I had learned that my value wasn't determined by their recognition. I arrived at university with a hunger that was almost feral, determined to excel, to build skills, to create opportunities, to become the kind of person the world couldn't ignore. I declared a dual major in computer science and business, a combination that was unusual enough to raise eyebrows from advisors but made perfect sense to me. I wanted to understand both the technical and commercial sides of technology, wanted to be able to build things and also understand how to scale them, market them, and monetize them. While other students were partying and discovering who they were, I was working 20 hours a week for a digital marketing agency while maintaining a 4.0 GPA, while building my own projects on the side, while teaching myself skills that weren't part of any curriculum because I had learned that the most valuable knowledge often came from self-directed learning. I was hungry in a way that was almost frightening. I wanted to build something that would change my life, that would change my family's understanding of me, that would prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that I was not the forgettable second child, that I was not someone to be dismissed or ignored, that I was someone worth paying attention to. By my third year of university, I had landed something I thought would be my ticket to legitimacy, a full-time position at a growing digital marketing agency, though I was still technically a student completing my final year of coursework. They hired me as a junior strategist, and I threw myself into the work with an intensity that alarmed even my coworkers. I was the first one in the office, the last one to leave, and I volunteered for every project, every client challenge, every problem that needed solving. Within 6 months, I had been promoted to senior strategist, and within a year I was leading a team of 4 people. My salary had more than tripled from my initial offer, and for the first time in my life I had genuine disposable income. Money that was entirely mine, earned through my own efforts, validation of my worth reflected in cold, hard numbers on a paycheck. I remember the first time I looked at my bank account and saw 6 figures. I actually cried, not from happiness but from relief, from the visceral knowledge that I would never again be dependent on anyone for survival, that I had finally secured the autonomy that had driven every decision I'd made since I was a teenager. It was around this time that my family's awareness of my financial trajectory began to crystallize. My mother called one evening with a strange tone in her voice, asking detailed questions about my salary, my benefits, my bonuses, information I had always kept private, but in a moment of vulnerability or perhaps hope that they might finally see me as successful, I shared some details. What I didn't realize was that I had just painted a target on myself. My father, whose business continued to struggle despite his relentless efforts, suddenly began asking me for advice on investments and financial strategies. My sister, who had graduated from law school and was working at a mid-level firm, started making comments about how my tech job was probably overpaying me, implying that my success was somehow less legitimate than her prestigious legal position. My mother began dropping hints about family financial obligations, about how well off I seemed, about how nice it would be if I could help with various household expenses. The narrative shifted almost imperceptibly. I went from being the forgotten child to being the useful one, and that transformation was equally painful in its own way because it stripped away any illusion that their attention, when it came, was based on genuine care or pride in my accomplishments. During my final year of university, I was completing my senior project on scalable digital business models when an idea hit me with such force that it felt like an electric current running through my body. I had spent years watching how digital marketing agencies operated, seeing their inefficiencies, noticing the gaps in their service offerings, understanding the market better than people who had been in the industry for decades. What if I could build something better? What if I could combine automation, data analytics, and strategic thinking into a service model that was more efficient, more effective, and more profitable than anything currently on the market? I pitched the idea to my team lead, expecting skepticism, but instead, he encouraged me to develop it as my senior project. I poured everything into that project: my research, my creativity, my technical knowledge, my business acumen. I built prototypes, ran simulations, created financial projections, and by the time I presented it to my university panel, it was arguably more polished and market-ready than many actual startups. One of the panel members was an angel investor, and after my presentation, he asked to grab coffee with me. That coffee meeting changed the trajectory of my life. He saw the same potential I saw. He believed in the idea with a conviction that made me believe even more in myself. He connected me with other investors, introduced me to mentors in the startup space, and most importantly, he offered me seed funding to turn my project into a real company. I was 23 years old, still technically a student, and I had just been handed the opportunity of a lifetime. I made the decision to take a semester off from university to focus on the startup. A decision that my parents reacted to with a mixture of concern and skepticism. My father thought I was throwing away my education. My mother worried I was making a rash decision. And my sister made snide remarks about how I was taking unnecessary risks when I had a perfectly good job. But what they didn't understand was that for me, this wasn't risky. This was the culmination of every choice I had made, every skill I had painstakingly developed, every late night and early morning spent learning and building. I incorporated the company, Dynamo Digital Solutions, and we launched with 2 founding team members, myself as CEO and my university mentor as Chief Strategy Officer. We had enough funding for about 18 months of operations if we were frugal, enough runway to prove the concept and secure additional funding. Those 18 months were some of the most intense, exhilarating, and terrifying of my life. We worked from a small office space that was barely bigger than a closet, with secondhand furniture and a dream that felt simultaneously within reach and impossibly distant. I slept in the office most nights, working until 2 or 3 a.m. and then catching a few hours of sleep on a couch before starting again at 5 a.m. My co-founder was equally dedicated, and together we burned with a fire that I think only people who have nothing to lose and everything to prove can truly understand. Our first client was a local e-commerce company struggling with customer acquisition, and we implemented a comprehensive digital strategy that increased their revenue by 34% within 3 months. That success was the breakthrough we needed. Word spread, inbound inquiries started coming in, and suddenly we had a waiting list of companies wanting our services. By month 6, we had 5 clients. By month 12, we had 23. By month 18, we were hitting our stride, and I was pitching to venture capital firms for our series of funding round. The pitches were nerve-wracking. I was competing against teams with decades of experience, teams with prestigious university credentials, teams with existing networks in the venture capital space. But I had something they didn't have, an intimate understanding of the problem we were solving, a hunger that was palpable, and most importantly, traction. I had real clients, real results, real revenue. We closed our series A round at a $4.2 million valuation, bringing in $1.2 million in funding that allowed us to expand the team, move to a better office, and most importantly, validate everything I had believed about the potential of this company. I remember the day the funding hit our bank account, watching the numbers appear on my screen, feeling a complex mixture of triumph and vindication and something else I couldn't quite name. I had done it. I had taken the neglect, the hunger, the determination born from years of invisibility, and transformed it into something tangible, something real, something that the world could see and value. I was 24 years old, and I was a founder of a funded startup with significant revenue and enormous potential. The moment I posted about the funding round on social media, something I was hesitant to do but my team encouraged, my family's response was immediate and shocking. My mother called within minutes, her voice gushing with enthusiasm, asking me to explain how much money I had made and what I planned to do with it. My father called a few hours later with a business proposition. A friend of his wanted to partner on something, and did I think I could help with connections or capital? My sister posted a congratulatory message on Facebook that was more self-congratulatory, talking about having a successful entrepreneur brother, as if she had somehow contributed to my success. Extended family members I hadn't heard from in years suddenly started liking my posts and sending friend requests. The email inquiries started coming in. Could I help cousin so-and-so with their business idea? Could I invest in an uncle's venture? Could I help with this person or that person's financial situation? It was disorienting, feeling the sudden shift in how I was perceived, realizing that my value had been upgraded in their eyes, and knowing simultaneously that this wasn't love or pride. This was opportunity-seeking. This was transactional. This was the worst version of what I had feared all along. Over the next year, the dynamic between me and my family deteriorated in ways I couldn't have fully anticipated. The financial success that should have been a moment of connection became a lightning rod for conflict and resentment. My mother's calls became more frequent and more focused on money. She had business ideas, that never quite materialized. She wanted to help with the house. She mentioned that my father was under a lot of stress, and wouldn't it be nice if I could ease some of the burden? My father, his own business finally collapsing under the weight of his poor decisions and changing market conditions, began showing up at my office unannounced with business partners or opportunity, essentially trying to leverage my success into solutions for his failures. One particularly painful incident occurred when he walked into my office with a man I'd never met and announced that they had a proposition for me. They wanted me to give them partial ownership of Dynamo in exchange for their mentorship and business wisdom. I was stunned. I had founded this company. I had sacrificed sleep and health and relationships to build it. I had nearly destroyed myself in the process, and here was my father, who had never believed in me, never supported me, never even acknowledged my potential, walking into my office and demanding equity as though he had some inherent right to a piece of my success. I refused as professionally as I could, but the damage was done. He left the office seething, and within days my mother was calling, crying about how ungrateful I was, how I owed them for raising me, how family should come first. My sister's resentment was more insidious and targeted. She had also entered the professional world, a junior associate at a prestigious law firm, and while her salary was respectable, it paled in comparison to my trajectory. She had leveraged our parents' financial support to attend an expensive private university and law school, had followed the path they had outlined for her, had done everything right. And yet here I was, the forgotten child, the quiet one, the one they had essentially abandoned to my own devices, and I was becoming vastly more successful than she was. Rather than celebrating my success, she began subtly undermining it. She made comments about how tech money isn't real money, about how my success was unsustainable, about how I must be cutting corners or dealing with shady characters to grow so quickly. She told extended family members that she was worried about me, that my rapid success seemed suspicious, that I was probably doing something unethical or illegal. These comments, delivered with the veneer of sisterly concern, were actually calculated attacks on my credibility and character. When family members would express pride in my accomplishments, she would quickly pivot to warnings about my stability or my morality. When I would post about company milestones, she would be one of the first to like it, but then I'd hear through the grapevine that she was making jokes about it to friends, minimizing the accomplishment, suggesting it was luck rather than skill. The emotional toll of this constant, low-level assault was significant. I found myself becoming defensive, over-explaining my business model to people who didn't actually care to understand it, trying to prove my legitimacy to people who had already decided I was somehow illegitimate. I would lie awake at night replaying conversations, analyzing whether my sister's comments had been malicious, or if I was being overly sensitive. I questioned my own ethics and methods, wondering if perhaps they were right, if perhaps I had done something wrong, if perhaps my success was somehow tainted. This self-doubt would manifest in the office. I became overly cautious about hiring decisions, overly focused on ethical practices even when they hurt our competitiveness, overly committed to transparency in ways that sometimes made negotiations more difficult than they needed to be. I was, in essence, allowing their doubts to pollute my confidence in myself. The business continued to grow despite the family drama, but the growth came at a cost. I was working 80, 90 hours a week, building an incredible team, serving an expanding client roster, and pushing towards Series B funding. I was also slowly burning out, though I didn't fully recognize it at the time. I wasn't sleeping well, I was eating irregularly. I was isolated because I was too busy and too emotionally drained to maintain friendships. A close friend from university, one of the few people I had maintained contact with through the startup grind, finally confronted me about it. She said I seemed angry all the time, that I was driven by something darker than ambition, that I seemed to be trying to prove something to people who didn't deserve my energy. That conversation was the first real crack in my armor, the first moment when I acknowledged that maybe my path wasn't as healthy as I had convinced myself it was. She suggested I see a therapist, and I initially dismissed the idea. I didn't have time, I was doing fine, I was just focused. But she persisted, and eventually I relented. Finding a therapist who understood both entrepreneurship and family trauma was challenging, but I eventually found Dr. Sarah, a woman in her late 50s who had her own startup history and who didn't seem to judge me for my intensity. Our first session was difficult. I came in prepared to talk about stress management techniques or time optimization strategies, but Dr. Sarah had other ideas. She asked me about my childhood, about my family relationships, about why I seemed to believe that my worth was contingent on external validation. I found myself getting emotional in ways I hadn't allowed myself to in years, talking about the painting that went in the closet, about the school performances with no applause, about the years of invisibility, about the sudden shift to being valued only when I had something to offer. Dr. Sarah listened without judgment, and at the end of the session, she said something that would become foundational to my healing. Your family's inability to see you when you were invisible didn't say anything about your worth. And their sudden interest now that you're successful doesn't validate your worth either. Your worth exists independently of their recognition. That simple statement, delivered with such compassionate clarity, began to shift something fundamental in my understanding of myself. Over the following months, I continued therapy, working through the complex web of resentment, grief, anger, and hurt that I had been carrying since childhood. I began to understand that I wasn't just trying to prove something to my family. I was trying to prove something to myself, and that mission had become corrupted by their presence in my life. I was building Dynamo not because I genuinely believed in the potential of digital marketing solutions, but because I was trying to prove I was valuable. That's a dangerous foundation for any venture because it means your motivation is external and vulnerable to the opinions and behaviors of people outside your control. I began the hard work of untangling my self-worth from my achievements, of recognizing that I could be proud of what I had built without needing anyone else's approval, of understanding that I could love my family without allowing them to determine my value. This internal work coincided with massive external growth for Dynamo. We secured Series B funding at a $12 million valuation, bringing in $3 million to accelerate our expansion. We opened a second office, hired 20 new employees, landed a Fortune 500 company as a client, and were featured in several major business publications as one of the most innovative digital marketing firms of the decade. By any objective measure, I had succeeded beyond the wildest expectations I had held even a few years earlier. But the internal shift from therapy meant that these victories, while still gratifying, didn't carry the same emotional weight they once had. They didn't validate me anymore. They were simply the natural results of hard work and good decisions. This shift in my own emotional landscape made family interactions even more stark and painful. Because now, freed from the desperate need for their approval, I could see their behavior for what it actually was: selfish, manipulative, and rooted in their own insecurities and financial desperation. My mother's calls about money became increasingly desperate and frantic. My father's attempts to leverage my success became more aggressive and bizarre. He actually asked me to co-sign a multimillion-dollar loan for a real estate venture that had virtually no chance of succeeding. My sister began making increasingly biting comments about how I was forgetting where I came from, how I was too busy for family, how I had sold my soul to the startup world. Extended family members started openly asking me for loans, investment capital, job placements, and connections, and when I started saying no, the response was swift anger. I became known as the rich one who won't help, as selfish, as too good for his family. Family gatherings became minefields of tension and resentment, and I found myself either attending and spending the evening defending myself and my choices, or declining and facing multiple phone calls accusing me of thinking I was too good for family obligations. The breaking point came unexpectedly, almost anticlimactically, which was somehow more painful than if it had been a dramatic explosion. It was the evening of my father's 60th birthday party, a celebration I had genuinely considered skipping, but my mother had called multiple times, practically begging me to attend, assuring me it would be different this time, that my father really wanted me there. I went, hoping against hope that maybe, finally, things could be different between us. The party was held at a restaurant, with about 40 family members and close friends in attendance. I arrived with a gift, a tasteful watch I had selected carefully, something I thought he might appreciate, and I tried to be present, to engage with relatives, to smile and celebrate. But the undercurrent of resentment was palpable. Relatives kept making comments about my fancy appearance, my success, my interesting career choice. My sister made a toast about appreciating where we come from in a way that was clearly directed at me. My mother kept introducing me to relatives as my son the entrepreneur in a way that felt performative, like she was showing off a possession rather than celebrating a person. And then came the moment that crystallized everything. My father's former business partner approached me with a proposition. He was starting a new venture and wanted me to invest and lend my expertise. When I gently declined, explaining that I needed to focus on Dynamo and that I made it a policy not to invest in personal connections, he looked at me with genuine confusion and said, "But you have so much money now. Doesn't it seem ungrateful to not help family friends?" That word, ungrateful, seemed to follow me everywhere. I left the party early that evening, drove around the city for hours, and finally went to Dr. Sarah's emergency session. I had learned over the course of therapy that she had an emergency line for situations like this. In her office, I finally articulated the reality that had been building for months. I could not maintain a relationship with my family if it was going to be predicated on me being a resource to extract from. I could not spend my emotional energy trying to prove my worth to people who had decided my worth long ago and only changed their assessment when money entered the equation. I could not continue to kill myself with guilt about not doing enough, not giving enough, not being enough, for people who had never done enough, given enough, or been enough for me when I needed it most. Dr. Sarah helped me draft a message, carefully worded, firm but not cruel, honest but not devastating, that I sent to my parents and sister that night. "I love you, but I need to be honest about something. Over the past year, my financial success seems to have changed how you relate to me, and I've realized that the foundation of our relationship might not be strong enough to support this dynamic. Mom, I can't be your financial solution. Dad, I can't be your business opportunity. Sister, I can't be the target of your resentment. I care about each of you, but I can't continue a relationship that is based on guilt, manipulation, or expectation. I'm asking for space, not permanently but for a while, to figure out what a healthy relationship with each of you might look like. If you want to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine care, I'm open to that. But that's the only foundation I'm willing to build on going forward." The response was swift and brutal. My mother called me, crying and angry, saying I was ungrateful and selfish and that I was proving I had changed, had become arrogant, had forgotten where I came from. My father sent a cold email saying he was disappointed in me and that he didn't appreciate my attitude. My sister, perhaps most hurtfully, posted a vague but pointed message on social media about people who think they're too good for their families and made sure I saw it. For the first week, I spiraled. Despite all the therapy work, despite all the intellectual understanding that their behavior was unreasonable, I still felt the pull of guilt, still questioned whether I was being too harsh, still wondered if I should just give them what they wanted and make the conflict go away. But I didn't. I stayed firm in my boundary. And that firmness, that refusal to be moved by guilt or anger or manipulation, was perhaps the most important decision I made in my entire healing journey. I focused on my work, threw myself into building Dynamo with a clear conscience for the first time in years. I invested time and energy in my genuine friendships, people who had supported me and celebrated me, and asked nothing but my authentic presence. I started mentoring young entrepreneurs, particularly those from disadvantaged backgrounds, and found that this work gave me a sense of purpose that success alone never could have. I began writing about my experiences, not publicly yet, but in private journals and blog posts, processing my journey and realizing that my story might have value beyond my personal healing. 6 months passed in relative silence from my family. Then, out of the blue, I received a text from my mother. Just 2 words, "I'm sorry." I didn't respond immediately. I was cautious, having been hurt too many times before. But a week later, she called, and for the first time in my adult life, my mother actually listened to me. I told her about my childhood, about how her selective attention had made me feel invisible, about how the shift to seeking money from me had compounded rather than healed that pain. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said something I never thought I'd hear. "I didn't realize. I didn't mean to make you feel that way, but now that you're saying it, I can see it. I'm sorry. It wasn't a complete resolution, and it wasn't enough to immediately erase years of pain, but it was a beginning." Over the following months, I had similar conversations with my father and sister, though those were more complicated and less complete. My father never fully acknowledged his role in my childhood neglect, But he did apologize for trying to extract equity from my company, and he gradually stopped making financial demands. My sister took longer. She was angrier, more resistant, but eventually, she acknowledged that her resentment had been rooted in her own insecurity, that she had lashed out at me rather than confronting her own sense of inadequacy. These reconciliations weren't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still moments when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, still times when I had to gently but firmly reinforce my boundaries. But there was also genuine connection emerging, connection that was based on honesty and mutual respect rather than guilt and obligation. I realized that the healing wasn't about forcing forgiveness or manufacturing closeness that didn't exist. It was about creating space where genuine connection could emerge if both parties were willing to meet each other there. A year after setting my boundary, I was invited to a family dinner for my sister's birthday. I was hesitant but decided to attend. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely at ease at a family gathering. There was no undercurrent of tension, no subtle jabs, no guilt tripping. We talked and laughed, and while we didn't suddenly become the close-knit family I had always fantasized about, we became something more valuable, a family that could be together without causing each other harm. By my late 20s, my life had transformed completely. Dynamo had grown to over 100 employees, with offices in 3 countries and a client roster that included household names. I had been featured on the covers of business magazines, had been invited to speak at major conferences, had been approached with acquisition offers that I declined because I was genuinely building something I believed in, not just something I was running away from. I was building towards something that genuinely excited me. I had relationships, real, genuine friendships with people who cared about me for who I was, not what I could provide. I had reconnected with my college friend, and our friendship had eventually evolved into something more. She had always believed in me in a way that was unconditional, and eventually, I was able to receive that belief without trying to prove that I deserved it. My relationship with my family, while still somewhat reserved, had become authentic. We had moved from a dynamic of obligation and resentment to one of genuine, if cautious, affection. My mother had even started a small business of her own, something I had gently encouraged, and was finding her own sense of independence and purpose. My father had softened significantly, even to the point of seeking therapy to understand his own patterns of emotional distance and work-related anxiety. My sister had eventually started her own consulting firm, combining her legal knowledge with business strategy, and we had even collaborated on a pro bono project for a nonprofit that provided free legal services to startups. The journey from invisible to successful hadn't been about proving my worth to my family. It had been about discovering that my worth existed independent of their recognition, had been about building a life of integrity and purpose, had been about learning to set boundaries that protected my peace, and had been about creating space for genuine connection when both parties were willing to show up authentically. For anyone who is currently in a situation similar to what I experienced, I want to say this: your family's inability to see you, to appreciate you, to support you, says nothing about your inherent worth or value. Your success doesn't need to be validated by anyone. Not your parents, not your siblings, not society. The real measure of success is whether you can live with integrity, maintain your boundaries, and build relationships that are based on genuine mutual respect and care. Sometimes that means distance from people who hurt you, even if those people are family. Sometimes that means choosing to stand alone rather than compromise your values for connection. And sometimes, if you're lucky and if both parties are willing, it means that distance and firmness eventually creates the foundation for a real relationship to emerge. I'm grateful for my journey, even the painful parts, because it taught me who I am independent of anyone's expectations or opinions. That's a gift that all the money in the world couldn't have purchased. Edit 1. Several people asking if I've completely cut off my family. No, but I did set firm boundaries that changed the nature of our relationship. Sometimes distance and clarity are what's needed to eventually rebuild something healthier. Edit 2. To the young people feeling unseen and undervalued, keep building, keep learning, but don't make success about proving something to the people who hurt you. Build for yourself. That's when it becomes meaningful. Edit 3. My therapist, Dr. Sarah, was instrumental in my journey. If you're struggling with family trauma or issues around self-worth tied to achievement, I genuinely encourage you to seek professional mental health support. Changed my life. Edit 4. The most important thing I learned isn't in my business cards or my company valuation. It's that I am worthy of love and respect simply for existing, not for achieving. That realization is what actually set me free.